even the way we set up our rooms, even the fact that we build special buildings. We have all kinds of things that come out of history, and when you understand the story behind that, then it gives you a better idea on which to assess whether or not we do things right, and what are the strong points and what are the weak points for a lot of the things we do. Did you know there are Christians today that don't sit in church the way we sit in church? It hasn't always been that churches were organized with a pulpit in the front. You know, this came out of church history. It actually was a development in the United States in Christianity about the 1700s, late 1700s, early 1800s. In the United States, it was called a movement called Congregationalism, where groups of Christians, congregations of Christians, decided that they were going to control their churches rather than having some bishop in a far-off part of the world control their church. And so the people started to vote in their own pastors, and then that's where that whole idea came from, you know. And that's an example of something out of church history that determines. The first Christians met in people's homes, in rich people's homes, and they were mostly slaves, and they probably stood wherever there was room to stand, right? And they probably didn't meet at, in fact, most definitely they didn't meet at Sunday morning at 10 o'clock for meetings. The only time that the earliest Christians could get together was after the work was all done during the day, and then late at night they would probably gather together because most of the early Christians were slaves. So they had to serve their masters all day, and then when their day's work was done, then they could go and do their own thing, see? And so the earliest Christians didn't meet like this at all. See? So there have been many changes down through the history of the church. And doctrines that we believe and hold dear today are doctrines that have been hammered out in discussions and debates and arguments, in even wars over doctrines within the Christian church. Aren't you glad we don't kill each other over doctrine today? Sometimes we have arguments, right? But there was a time when if you believed a certain thing and the other side caught you, they'd burn you at the stake, man. They'd kill you. They'd run you through with a sword and a spear, right? So the history of the Church of Jesus Christ is a fascinating story. Very few Christians really understand it. So the first week that we started studying this, goes back about a month and a half or so, we covered the first century, the first 100 years of the church, which is actually partially recorded or mostly recorded in our Bibles. The first century, the first 100 years, is actually recorded in the Bible. The church began about 30 A.D., and the last book in the Bible, the book of Revelation, is dated about 100 A.D., and so for that 70 years or 60-some years, that's when the apostles were basically alive, and that's when they founded the churches. Paul went through his missionary journeys through Asia and into Italy, through Greece and into Italy, and some people think he even went to Spain. And some of the apostles went to North Africa and down into Ethiopia, and their converts spread throughout the world. And so the churches, local churches, were being founded all over the world, the Roman world at that time, in the first 100 years. And this is when Christianity was its purest. It was closest to the teaching of the men whom Jesus himself trained. Now the second page, I think you have that, the second and third centuries, which covers the years from 100 A.D. to the end of 200 A.D., for 200 years. This is called by some church historians the Episcopal period, where the church left its first love. Episcopal is a word that means bishops, rule by bishops. Now, in many churches and denominations today, church leaders are known as the bishops. The Catholic Church has bishops. The Lutheran Church has bishops. There are Nestorian churches in Ethiopia and India and Syria that have bishops. The Greek Orthodox Church has bishops. There are many thousands of churches around the world that have bishops. Now, we don't take that word, even though it's a biblical word. If a man desires the office of a bishop, he desires a good work. 1 Timothy chapter 3, verse 2. There's nothing wrong with using the word bishop, but the problem is that the word has been associated with groups of Christians, or people who call themselves Christians, who have turned away from the Bible's teaching on the way to do church, and it's become politics. All right? And this happened very early in the church. About the time, just after the apostles died, church leaders began to, it was dirty inside politicking, struggle for control over areas in the Roman world. And so these men became known as bishops, and this continued for several hundred years into about the 400s and 500s. We're going to even notice that today in our study. And churches changed from being little local congregations of simple Christians that would have 2 or 3 godly, mature men who would be the pastor, teachers, or the elders in the churches, and they would work hand in hand with a few men who would be deacons or women that would be deaconesses to operate and manage the local churches. And local churches were always small. But within 200 or 300 years, churches became large. And they started to build big buildings. And so now they would have several hundred people coming, even thousands of people coming, and these men would become known as bishops, overseers. And then the bishops would meet with the other bishops from the big cities of Rome, of the Roman Empire, and they would make decisions, and they would make the decisions, take it home and tell the people what they had to believe and how they had to act. And this became known as Episcopalian government, where you have bishops at the top ruling the people. And it became even worse when the Roman Empire began to degenerate, and these men began to assume political power as well as religious and ecclesiastical power. And then it just became ungodly, as it is today. The Roman Catholic Church, for example, is almost entirely, almost 100% apostate. The very few people and leaders in Catholic churches teach and preach the gospel of Jesus Christ, undiluted, without adding something to it. And the so-called mainline denominations from the Reformation era in the 1500s, same thing. They've kind of deadened and anyway, the church left its first love. And it was largely because of this big problem where the church began to organize itself in an unbiblical way. Okay, so that's section 2. I think it would be good if you reread that to familiarize yourself with it. The last time we got together, we looked at the first division under what is known as the Roman period. The Roman period of the church in the 300s through the 1200s, or the 4th or the 13th centuries. You could call this the paganizing of the Christian religion. I don't know if any of you have ever studied history or watched television, on A&E, on the Crusades and all this kind of stuff. How many of you watch that kind of stuff and read about it? Okay? Did you know that they're known as the Christian Crusades, but there was nothing whatsoever Christian about them? The Crusades were executed by people who thought they were Christians, who called themselves Christians, who wrote about themselves as being Christians, but they were not genuine Christians. They were Christians in name only. That's called nominal Christians. The true Christians did not involve themselves in those things. Where in the Bible does it say you're supposed to take up a sword and kill your enemy? Didn't Jesus teach the exact opposite? Jesus stood before Pilate and said, if my followers were of this world, they would fight you with their armies. No. The kingdom of God is spiritual in the hearts of men. Right? So about by the 300s and in the 400s, the church that is known to history was really an apostate group. I mean, there were Christians in it at this period of time. It was still the one book I have, the author calls it the Christian Roman period. In other words, for a couple of hundred years, the Roman universal church, that's what the word Catholic means. Catholic means universal. The universal Roman church, based in northern Italy with its influence all over the Mediterranean world and into Britain and so forth, they still did have truly born-again, many born-again Christian leaders. All right? Many of them were truly born again, but the seeds were being sown, the foundation was being laid for the church to turn away from the truth eventually within a few generations. So the Roman period is such a large period, we subdivide it into three. And in the overview on page 3, it says, three major developmental periods cover 1,000 years of history. The age of Constantine, A, B, the age of Germanization, and C, the age of expansion. All right? And so part 3, we already surveyed the age of Constantine, which was basically the 300s. And this was when, for the first time, Christianity became a legal religion in the Roman Empire. The Roman government quit jailing and persecuting and killing Christians because Constantine had had some kind of a miraculous experience on the way into battle in his bid to take control over the Roman Empire. He was a general, and he came from the north into Italy, and he was fighting Maximilian, who was entrenched in the city of Rome with his armies. And the day before the battle, Constantine saw a sign of a cross in the sky with the words, "In this name conquer," and he was a superstitious man. He was a pagan man, and he said to himself, if I win this battle, I will become a follower of the man who hung on that cross. Right? And so within weeks, he had become victorious, and he became a Christian, unquote. But it was a lot of superstition, and a lot of people debate whether he was even born again. But he became the emperor, and he became, therefore, quote, a Christian, in name at least. And when the general of his army became a Christian, he told all of his soldiers, you become Christians. And so all of his army, or most of his army, was baptized Christian. Do you think they understood what they were talking about? No. Nominal Christians, right? But because he was Christian, and because there were still many godly, truly born-again spiritual leaders within Christianity in the 300s, he allowed these men and encouraged these men in their work, their Christian work. See? And so he actually supervised councils of the church where many godly men came to debate theology. Okay? And one of the great issues of this time period was something known as Arianism, a teaching of a man from Egypt who was a Christian leader named Arius, and he taught that Jesus was not the same as Jehovah, that Jehovah was the one true God, that he created Jesus, and then Jesus was the person who created all the rest of the universe. So we have big God, Jehovah, we have small God, Jesus, who's the creator, but they're not equal. Does that remind you of anything today? Yes, Jehovah's Witness theology right to the T. You know, as Solomon said, there's nothing new under the sun. Right? And so this is an example, a good example of how ancient developments in history resurface time and again, and the devil continues to deceive people with ideas that have been around for hundreds, even thousands of years. Okay? And so the age of Constantine was a time when the church was legitimized politically and socially, but when that happened, when it cost nothing then to become a Christian, because just like in our culture, it doesn't cost anything. If you want to call yourself a Christian, is anybody going to beat you up and burn your house? No. Now it was legal to be a Christian, and so with true Christians came a host of people who were only Christian in name, you see. And this was actually a weakening thing for the true church of Jesus Christ. Right? That was one of the major results of what happened during the time of Constantine. Now, part 4, we're going to move to the so-called age of Germanization. The next page. Let's just go through this. We're talking 400s and 500s AD now, okay? The age of Germanization. We don't even have a really good map of the world here. We have one, but everybody's facing the wrong direction. All right? But anyway, can you picture Europe? Most people are really bad in geography. How many are good in geography and history? Hands up. Come on. About 4 people. Okay. Do you know, does anybody here know where Europe is? Yeah. It's on the other side of the Atlantic Ocean. So if you went down to Toronto, got on a big plane, right, with enough fuel and big enough motors, and you flew about 6 hours straight east, you would come to Europe. Okay? Well, England, which is just across the channel. Okay? So, Europe is where France, Germany, Spain, Portugal, Czechoslovakia, Hungary, Poland, you know, that's Europe. Okay? And what is the country east of Europe? You have Russia. Well, that's in the Orient. Okay? So if this represents sort of a block of that part of the world, you have Europe over here, you have Britain, you've got Germany, France, Italy, Switzerland, Portugal down here, you know, you got Italy, you got still have Greece, right? And then you have Yugoslavia where they're fighting the Croatians and the Bosnians, all that's taking place, and then straight north of that you've got Hungary and Switzerland, and you've got Poland, and then you've got Latvian countries up there, and then you've got Russia, the big one up here. But Russia used to be part of the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, the USSR. And as of the 1990s, that disintegrated. Russia still exists as a big country, but all of these Muslim countries along the bottom, all the Stan countries, Stan means people. So all the Muslim tribal people left over from history, they inhabit all this, all the way over to Mongolia, right, and to China over in the Orient, okay? And then south of China, you've got Japan out in the water, you've got Korea, and you've got Thailand and Laos and Vietnam, and then you've got the Indonesian Pacific Islands, okay? So there's an idea, right? So we're going to get started. Oh, the Germanization of Christianity. So here's Russia, and you've got Azerbaijan, you've got Turkmenistan and Kazakhstan, all these people. That's where the Huns came from. Anybody ever heard of Attila the Hun? Right? This is all flat country. When you get above the Himalayas, it's all grain-growing country, right? And these people, for some reason, they went on the warpath in the 400s. In the 300s, actually in the 300s, the Huns came across Russia, what today is Russia, and they started to invade Eastern Europe, in Poland, what today is Poland, Hungary, Czechoslovakia, Germany. And the tribes that lived up here, they were known as Goths. You have Ostrogoths, that's the East Goths. You have the Visigoths, which is the West Goths from what today is France, and you've got Vandals, right? Just like vandalism, that's where that word came from. It came from the Vandals, because out of history, these people, their territory, they were running from these fierce Mongoloid tribes that were coming from the east, and they were being wiped off the map, and so they were pushed, and when they were pushed, then they couldn't go into the ocean, right? So they went to southwest Europe, and they came into northern Italy, and they went across from Spain. It's just a spit across the North Africa there at the Straits of Gibraltar. You can see Africa from Spain over here, and they went all across North Africa, and when they became established there, then they got their fleet and their navies, and they attacked Rome, which was the dominant power. And during this period of time, politically, the Germanic tribes from Central Europe were invading Italy and wreaking havoc in the political structures of the empire. Twice, in 410 and 455 AD, these tribes from the north, the Ostrogoths and the Vandals, all right, the Visigoths from the west who had come this way, they attacked Rome and actually broke the walls down, went through the city and stole everything they wanted, raped and pillaged and left the city a smoldering ruin, twice, right? And in 476, the Visigoths finally, there's a guy named Clovis, who was a tribal chief name that came in from the north, through what today is Switzerland. He came in and he destroyed the Roman Empire in 476, the western half of the Roman Empire. The Roman Empire was so large that we actually mentioned it here that the Roman Empire had divided in about 395 over doctrine, all right, and politics. So the Pope and the Roman Emperor of the West was having a dispute with a guy from Constantinople, which is the entrance to the Black Sea up there south of Russia, right? And they were having big arguments politically and religiously. And so they basically were split in 395 AD, and the western half of the Roman Empire became weaker, and it succumbed to all this political turmoil that was going on, and so the barbarian Germanic tribes actually took over the western half of the Roman Empire. And that introduced what in history has been known as the Dark Ages. Why are they called dark? Was it always dark? Did the sun not shine for 1,000 years?
Because the people were so ignorant that we lost all the knowledge and wisdom and knowledge of our area.
Exactly. The Teutonic tribes, the Germanic tribes, were hunters, fishers, and they loved nothing more than war. That's what they lived for. They didn't live for education and culture. Okay? The Romans, from antiquity, they were a very cultured people for hundreds of years, right? And so when their civilization was destroyed by these barbarians, then civilization fell, right? Learning fell, culture fell, and the only place that it really survived was in the monasteries left over from the Roman Catholic Church. It was a big movement during this period of time. Okay? The Roman Church now assumed real political power. The story is told that when Clovis, this barbarian king, came into Rome, the city was quaking in its boots, and Leo, who was the first pope of the Church of Rome, he went and took his cart with him, and they risked his life. And he went out on the road and met Clovis outside of the city of Rome and said, let's make peace. Let's make peace. The politicians were too weak, and the country was divided politically, but this was the main religious leader. Everybody looked up to this guy, so he went up and he spoke with the invaders and said, we can help you rule and govern the country because we already know the people, we're already established in our churches all over the place, people respect us, we have spiritual authority, so let us help you. And so the barbarians were wise enough to realize they could use these people, these religious leaders. So they sued for peace. And right then, on the road outside north of Rome, this up till now had been just a religious organization, the Roman Catholic Church. Now it became a political force in Europe in the 400s AD. Now they were allied with the politicians, with the Germanic invaders who were victorious. Okay? And the barbarians used these religious leaders to help them govern the country. So immediately, in the western half of the Roman Empire, the religious leaders of the Church of Rome became politically powerful While the Dark Ages descended upon Roman society, the monasteries, the Roman Church preserved knowledge, literature, and learning. See, the invaders didn't bother the monasteries because they were part of the religious establishment, all right? And in the monasteries, there were libraries, there were ancient books, there were ancient copies of the scriptures. This was where culture and knowledge resided for hundreds and hundreds of years. And in fact, out of the monasteries, 1,000 years later, came the revival in public, in the everyday life of knowledge. It was called the Renaissance, the rebirth. That's a French word, again, naissance, birth. Renaissance. The rebirth of civilization came out of the monasteries, where all this books and stuff had been secluded and kept away from social disaster, you see. So it was an act of God, really, in a sense. God uses even the wicked to accomplish his purposes. The seeds of the later church state conflicts were set in place by the balance of political power between rival leaders in North Italy and France. See, Rome is right here. It hangs down in Italy. Okay, you have Greece over here, and then you've got France and Portugal and Spain. Actually, you've got France comes down. You have Spain over here, and France is up here. Okay. Now, the leader of the Franks, that was the name of the German tribe. They were known as the Franks. That's where the English word French, or the name French came from history. In the 400s, the dominant political leaders of the barbarians were the Frankish tribe, and their leader was a guy named Albion, wasn't it? Yeah, no, Clovis. And in northern Italy, the Visigoth leader was a guy named Albion. Now, this is kind of important because throughout the following 700 or 800 years, there was going to be an east-west conflict between the Roman church leaders, right? The Italians versus the French. And that explains the origins of it, because both of these political leaders who were barbarians had become Christian, quote unquote, right? By joining the Roman Catholics, okay? With all their people. They would baptize all their soldiers and all their people, right? And become Christian, quote unquote, right? At least in name, okay? Just to show you why that's important, there came a point in Roman Catholic history where the Italian papacy was fighting the French papacy, and there was a period of 70 years at one point where there were two popes with two courts. One was over here in southern France, and one was in Rome and Italy, and they wouldn't recognize each other. And this guy said, "I'm the Pope." This guy said, "I'm the Pope," right? And they tried to run the Roman Catholic Church for a long time, and there was, even today, there's still divisions within the Roman Catholic Church between the French and the Italians, even today. All right. Anyway, the eastern half of the Roman Empire was largely unaffected by the fall of the western half, because these people spoke Latin, and their center of power was Rome in northern Italy. These people spoke Greek over here in Constantinople, where there was a very important church leader, right? And the barbarian tribes never did conquer the Greek, this portion of the world, from Yugoslavia east, okay, Asia Minor, and up into the Albania today and Romania, all of that area. For some reason, these Germanic tribes went west and south instead of south and east. They never went east. Okay, and so the Eastern Roman Empire politically was very powerful. They were never defeated. Right? They were never defeated. Okay, and so today, that's why in Sault Ste. Marie, for example, you've got Roman Catholic churches and you've got Greek Orthodox churches, or Eastern Orthodox churches. That's where few minor divisions. For example, these people believe that it's sinful to make three-dimensional statues and images of Mary and of Christ and stuff like that. They only have pictures, two-dimensional. Right? This is very important to them. It came out of history. Right? This is one of the things that led. It was like in 1054 they decided we can't tolerate each other, but that was only an excuse. What was really going on was political intrigue, right?
Well, they wanted the eastern side of the church recognized the Church of Constantinople as the leader of the church, and the other part of the Pope. So that's what the split was about. Who was the authority in the church? That was the Constantinople or Pope. And the eastern side refused to look at the Pope because of all the corruption that was going on in the election side of the church. So they sort of charged everything to the Pope and the authority.
Exactly. So you've hit it on the head.
It was also a wave in the calendar time in the dates of church dating, like as for instance, in the Eastern church, but they believe it's really Easter.
Okay. There is, and I think Christmas is recognized in January or something by the Greek Orthodox.
So the calendar, Western Church operates on the Julian calendar, and then the Eastern on the Gregorian calendar. And the Gregorian calendar is more aligned with the lunar cycle. That's why the Orthodox Church recognizes the lunar calendar and that's later than the rest of it.
Interesting. But you know something? These things created intense religious conflict between the two halves of the Roman Empire, starting from the 400s even, right? But the real issue was politics and power control, right? These things were just excuses. Different calendars, you have different spiritual leaders. This guy is known as the Patriarch, this guy is known as the Pope. These people over here believe that Jesus Christ, there was something known as the Filioque controversy later on, about 1000 AD. These people believe that Jesus Christ was sent by only the Father. The Holy Spirit was sent only by the Father. These people, the Roman Catholic side, believe that the Holy Spirit was sent by both the Father and the Son. All right? Well, doctrine becomes an excuse, just like it happens in churches today. Doctrine will become the excuse for real division. The underlying reality is that it's personality conflicts and struggle for power. Right? That's what happens today.
Even when you study other church history, like this is John Reed, they read a book recently on American history, and within about 50, 40 years after the Reverend lived that going, they split basically over personality, who was right, whether it's Darby or whether it's Mueller, and that's where the company still exists today. What's that? And that's why you have closed drive and open drive in churches, because of that split in the first 20 or 30 years of the struggle. So his personality, Darby wanted to control, and Mueller said, no, I'm not going to go over there.
I think so. Some of the doctrinal distinctives of the eastern half of the church, that come from the 400s, is that these people here will give their parishioners both wine and host, but in the western half, the people don't get to taste the wine, just the priest. Okay, that's another one. So there's all kinds of little things, but essentially they have the same basic theological bias. It's neat. The Greek Orthodox and Catholics believe one God, they believe in the Trinity, they believe in the deity of Jesus Christ. This is great because you have a lot of ends with these people, right? But the problem is they've got sacraments, works added to faith in order for salvation, and that's why together they form the largest cult in the world. The largest Christian cult in the world. A cult is a deviation from the truth. See? These people control millions and millions of people. Spiritually, what was happening in the 400s and the 500s? The leaders of the so-called, I call it Church of Rome in brackets because it's not truly a biblical church now, it's a political organization. It's an apostate group, right? The leaders of the Church of Rome became the visible church leaders in the so-called Christian world, but these people were very far by the 400s from being true Bible-believing Christians. Leo I was the first pope, but he was basically a shrewd politician in church garb. The Germanic leaders which conquered Rome were only nominal Christians, and usually when the tribal leader converted, all his warriors and their families would also convert. Few of these people were truly born-again Christians. Clovis, the leader of the Franks, converted nominally to Christianity, and he ruled all of Gaul, which is Western Europe, modern France and Spain. He was baptized with 3,000 of his warriors on Christmas Day, 496. The leaders of the other barbarian tribes had embraced Arian Christianity and were considered heretics by the Western Church. What is Arian? What does that mean? Jesus is a smaller God. The Franks in Western Europe embraced Orthodox Christianity, the form held by the Western Church. Okay? Jerome is a famous name. I've got a list of important people from this 200 years here. Jerome was a godly monk. He was a famous writer and theologian who lived in Bethlehem in Israel. He translated the Bible into Latin, and he wrote commentaries on the Bible. Augustine, who was a church bishop in North Africa, wrote The City of God and many other books. This was his most important book after the western half of the Roman Empire disintegrated. He's mentioned in church history part 3 because he lived through, from the 200s into the 300s, right? Very influential man today. We'll talk about him a little bit more. A British monk named Patrick evangelized Ireland and established many monasteries during this period of time. 100 years later, an Irish monk named Columba established a monastery on an island west of Scotland and worked to convert the pagan Scots. He died in 597. Other Irish monks took the gospel to the Rhine area in Central Europe, where today you have Germany. In 596, Pope Gregory sent Augustine and 40. That can't be right, because Augustine didn't live to 596. I've got to have to double check that. Sent a bunch of monks to evangelize the pagan Angles and Saxons who had conquered Britain. You and I all have white skin, and we're basically descended. Most of us are from European stock, right? Right? Maybe some of you are from Russian and Ukrainian stock, but if you're from Western Europe and you have white skin, you have Anglo-Saxon forebears, right? And those were two different Germanic tribes, okay, that settled in Northern Europe, right? So that's where the word Anglo-Saxon comes from two Germanic tribes. And these people were evangelized by the Catholics in the 600s. Cyril was the Patriarch of Alexandria, in the important Christian center in Egypt. John was the Patriarch of Antioch in Syria. And just over the page, we have a list of important doctrinal issues that were discussed and debated all through these 200 years. Augustine challenged the teachings of a British monk named Pelagius, who denied that man is totally depraved or that man has original sin. Who's right? Is man depraved? Are you born depraved? Are you born affected by Adam, or are you more or less neutral, and that you are born with a spark of divine goodness within you, and sometime during your life you make your choice for God or the devil? Which of the two is correct? Yes, the Bible says we're born in sin. We're conceived in sin. We are born with a sinful nature. We don't become sinners when we do something bad. We are born sinners. We have a sinful nature, and we actually sinned when Adam sinned. That's called original sin. Do you know something? Today, original sin is disbelieved by 90% of our culture. Most people today religiously are Pelagians in their theology, and they don't even know who Pelagius was. You talk to United Church, Presbyterian, Lutherans, the average person believes that, well, basically we're good, you're a good person. And they deny original sin. Now, Catholics teach original sin, which is good. All right? But this was an important issue, and Augustine stood up for the truth, even though he was off on other things. Pelagianism was condemned in a general church council held at the city of Ephesus in 431. About 100 years later, at the Council of Orange, an adaptation of this heresy known as semi-Pelagianism was condemned, which held that salvation faith is totally dependent on the sinner. In other words, semi-Pelagianism doesn't deny original sin, but it says that you may have been born a sinner, but you actually determine your destiny by your choice. God doesn't determine your destiny. See that? You are not chosen by God, you choose God. Right? That's not scriptural. Right? The Bible says that you're given faith to believe. It's a gift. Okay? And if you end up being saved, it's because God chose you in eternity past. So semi-Pelagianism is basically the same error over here that these people over here, these heretics, believe that you're not born a sinner and you have the control of your own spiritual destiny by the choices you make. Right? So the first one was Pelagianism, the second was semi-Pelagianism. They're both wrong. Okay, hierarchical government of the churches by bishops is something we've already talked about. This became a devastating development of this period in which most churches never recovered. Now, even though they didn't make the history books very often, there were simple Bible-believing Christians that lived all over the world. It's just they weren't politically in control, they weren't politically significant, and they didn't have a lot of influence in high places, right? But there were Bible-believing Christians all over the world. It's just that, they weren't part of the quote-unquote Roman Catholic Church. The simple Christians held to biblical, simple church government. We're going to be talking about that at 11 o'clock this morning. And this visible political church adopted this hierarchical form of government. Throughout the whole Roman Catholic Church, ordinary bishops became subordinate to metropolitan bishops. What is a metropolis? A large city. Okay? And so the church leader in Toronto would be more important than the church leader in Thessalon. All right? And so the church leader in Thessalon, for example, would submit to the decisions made by the church leader of, the Bishop of Toronto. And the Bishop of Toronto and New York and San Francisco and Montreal would submit to the decisions made by the Bishop of Rome. That's the way it is today. Still is today. Okay? This became known as monarchical government. The top bishop becomes basically a monarch or a king, and he rules. The Pope rules today. Okay? At least Roman Catholic churches. In the East, the counterpart to the Pope was known as the Patriarch, and they have a similar type of government over there, the Greek Orthodox. Monasticism was a movement where many godly men and women withdrew from ordinary life into seclusion and removed true Christian influence from ordinary life. In other words, people who became monks and nuns left the world, gave away their possessions, took a vow of poverty, and lived in a cell or a cave. There were even cases where people would live on top of posts or in trees or on tops of mountains, become hermits. They would go into the desert. It was these people that established the monastery of St. Catherine, what today is thought to be Mount Sinai down in Egypt. And even though these people would leave the organized world, the problem is they always took the world with them in here. See, monasticism did not work. It actually took people out of ordinary issues of life where they could influence lost people. And even though there were many godly people and great thinkers and great theologians and very influential spiritual leaders living in monasteries, writing books and stuff, teaching disciples, it was, in one sense it saved knowledge during the Dark Ages, but in the other sense it actually ruined society because the truly born-again people weren't even there. They were out there somewhere, see? Monasticism was a bad thing. And there was great debate, we got to quit. There was great debate during the 300s and the 400s, or the 400s and the 500s regarding the person of Jesus Christ. Who was Jesus? Was he God? Was he man?